innovation, and business planning. He's interested in finding new ways of looking at the relationship between data and outcomes in ways that improve decision-making and roster construction. Nobody knows what he's going to talk about.
Always love to be the guy standing between you guys and lunch. I hope you had a lot of food this morning because I'm gonna go along. Just warn you right now. No, just kidding. So thank you everybody for coming here. I'm happy to be here. I wish it was yesterday so I could be in a big room. It looked really great. I was hoping also that Micah, when he showed up in the morning there or for his talk, was a big puff of smoke and just kind of appeared in the middle, but maybe next year, Micah, work on that one. All right, we're good to go. So, what I really want to talk about, and for those of you that follow me on Twitter or read my stuff, I slam on hockey decisions all the time and hockey people making decisions. But I don't actually think that you need to actually take the hockey experience out of decision making. That you can have people with that hockey background making stats-based decisions. And not only can those two things coexist, I think they have to if you actually want to make better decisions. So today, I want to talk about how we as people make decisions and how we can actually structure that process to make better decisions using data to actually support the process. And it really comes down to the idea that your brains, well, maybe not this morning after the social last night, but your brains are really pretty good, like analytical machines. You know, you can do a lot of things. There's a lot of calculation going on all the time in your head. But typically, when you're making a decision, there's some kind of combination of instinct and intrinsic analysis going on in there. And it happens so fast and at a subconscious level that you don't really know how or why you made that decision. You think you do, and then you wind up rationalizing it afterwards, but it's kind of opaque to you. And you know, when you actually bring this back now to people making hockey decisions, you know, often that winds up being used. That's why you see people justifying things based on intangibles and other stuff like that, sort of these qualities that we can't really describe, but we know these players have them, right? And that's why we made that decision. You know, so if you think about, you know, the movie, it's, hey, these guys have them, we just don't know what they are, right? And if you can't really define what they are and how to tell who has them, then you're not really able to make decisions based on those kinds of things. So they're not a problem per se, it's just that they're a symptom of the problem, that we're actually making poor decisions if we can't really explain or understand why we made it. Now, that said, if you start actually believing the rationalizations that you're telling yourself and then use that in your decision next time, that is a problem. Like, you're kind of reinforcing the whole process. So, what does this say about how we make decisions? Go way back to the Greeks. They kind of thought of everything before everybody else did. But they kind of broke decision making down to two different types of decisions. You use intuition and you use reasoning. Those are kind of the two opposite and complementary, actually, ways of making decisions. In more recent years, psychologists have come along and they've done a lot of research and broken it down into sort of the system 1, system 2 types of decisions. Same as the Greeks, basically, just a whole lot more fancy words thrown in. But those system 1 decisions are the intuitive ones. They're made quickly, they're automatic, they're opaque, you don't really understand how they happen. And system 2 are that they're slower, more meticulous, rely on data, and also we typically follow some kind of rules. And so, why does it matter? Let's take a look at this example. So, if you have a hockey stick and a puck and it costs $1.10, the hockey stick costs $1 more than the puck, how much does the puck cost? Shout out your first answer comes to your head.
10 cents.
So whoever said the 10 cents, let their intuitive brain kind of just take that shortcut and say, hey, it's $1.10 minus $1 is 10 cents. But that's actually not right. It is for almost everybody else, nerds. It is 5 cents. Like, that is the actual answer. And that is, if you actually take the time and reflect, that you will come to that correct answer. And so the problem with sort of doing that taking those shortcuts and relying on that intuitive decision making is there's all kinds of biases, and you're not supposed to be able to read this, but just to show how many different, like each one of these things is an actual cognitive bias. There's tons of them. If you want to know more, go ahead and research them, but that's not what I'm going to get into today. Just to know that when you are making those intuitive decisions, those biases can actually start to affect your decision-making process, and you don't even know about it. So the point really is that this type of system one decision-making is more likely to mislead us, especially when the answer is not intuitive, or when there's lots of data to consider, or there's a lot of different options that require trade-offs. Now, I'm not saying that system one is better than system two. As we just heard in that last presentation, if you have Connor McDavid coming in on you on a breakaway in overtime, you don't really want to be analyzing this. It's got to be instinct. You got to make that decision right then, at that moment. Fleury actually stopped that shot, by the way. So system two is really less helpful in those time-constrained situations. I'll give you another example here. So for those of you that have read the book Black Swan, this is kind of taken that and modified it a little bit, but kind of talks about, I think he used Fat Tony and Dr. John. Well, we have Tony Soprano and Mr. Spock here, and they think in different ways, right? And so they go out for drinks with Garrett Hole. There's Garrett, and they're at the bar there for drinking. Garrett, who quite often tweets about flipping coins, decides to ask them a question. And so he tells them, hey, we got a fair coin, equal probability of heads or tails. If I flip it 99 times and it comes up heads every time, what's the probability of head on the next coin flip? So, Mr. Spock, well, it'd be highly illogical to think it would be anything other than 50%, right? It's independent, it's a fair coin, that's the probability. Tony Soprano, on the other hand, he knows the fix is in, right? If a coin is 99 times, if it's that unlikely to happen, then it's actually not a fair coin. So the model is wrong, right? You might think that that's how it's supposed to work, but in reality, it's not working that way. And so there's those kinds of issues can creep into that system two type of thinking. If you're just relying on kind of that rote, analytical, mechanical type of thinking process, decision-making process, you can also get those kind of errors seeping into the whole thing, and you wind up with poor decisions at the end. And so really the point here is that no thinking process, no model is perfect. And really when something unlikely is occurring, it's more likely that the model is wrong. So there's both types of models that are prone to error, there's limitations, and you really can make decisions using both of those types of processes at once. So at the organizational level, organizations make the same types of decisions. So you might have a business that is running analytics, and that's how they drive their decisions. That's your system two type of analytical, rational decision making. Or you can have the BogSat model, a bunch of guys sitting around talking. Right? I'm sure we've all watched this video right here, probably more than once. if you haven't, this is the Boston Bruins deciding whether or not to trade Tyler Seguin for whoever, really. Magic beans, as Reese would say. But yeah, so in this type of model, it's very little data is involved. It's sort of might be brought up a little bit through the discussion. There's a lot of rule of thumb reasoning. There's a search for an answer, but there's not any effort put into finding the best answer or the optimal answer. It's almost like just let's get to a decision. So really, the challenge is how do we make the best use of data to support better decisions? And here's Garrett again. He actually just tweeted this the other day, and I thought it was perfect, so I thought I'd throw it in here. But he's right on the money. Data is just a tool, but so is the decision-making process. And you need to kind of bring those things together and treat them as such, and you will actually improve your decision-making. So now, that doesn't mean that we should be using data to support decisions we've already made. That's not making better decision-making processes, right? And again, here's another example of somebody actually said that they'll believe the data if it confirms what they already have seen with their eyes. That is not good analysis. That kind of reminds me of the Brian Burke quote. Can't be a hockey analytics conference without Brian Burke. Since he's not here, I thought I'd say this for him. But that's his quote. It's actually wrong. This is not the actual quote. Because he actually, the way he says it, it kind of sounds like statistics are useful for support, which is actually, the opposite. I can't blame Skype for this. There we go. So this is the actual quote. It's from Andrew Lang in 1937, something like that. But really, the point is that you should use analytics or statistics for illumination, to actually give you some kind of insight, not for support. So I guess what we can say about maybe Brian Burke is that he uses quotes like he uses ties. Loosely and he's not in the room, because I don't want to meet him in a barn somewhere. So anyway, so how do we structure the decision-making process to make better use of data in support of better decisions? Well, let me flip this. Luckily for us, there's been a lot of research and work put into organizational decision-making, especially when it comes to making big investment decisions that have a lot of stakeholders involved, or there's a lot of complex trade-offs. And it's called structured decision-making, which, as a note, you should never let the nerds name anything, right? But yeah, so this is a process that's used in big organizations all the time to make sure that you're actually considering the data and eliminating bias from the process. And there's 5 key steps around the side here. So really clarify the problem, make sure your objectives and your criteria are all clear. What are your options? Collect and analyze the data, put it in a table, as we'll see, and then do some trade-off analysis, and then you can make your decision. And you can actually sort of iterate the process and keep going to refine the decision even farther. I could spend an hour on each of these steps, but honestly, no, we won't. We'll get to lunch. But here, I've got a handy guide for you if you want to know more about structured decision making. Right here. Would have animated this if I could, but you know how it works. So, what I do want to talk about today, though, is the whole process around evaluating trade-offs. Right. So you've done all this, hopefully. You've gone off. There's a lot of data analysts here in the room. You've gone to them and say, hey, here's what I want to evaluate. Get me the data. And now you actually want to make the decision and do the trade-offs and make the decision. So, how do we do that? I'll give you a simple example. All right, so let's say this is a case of you want to decide between a couple draft, or make a draft pick, right? You want to rank who's at the top of the list. Maybe you have first overall, I don't know, wherever you are. There's 4 players. You've narrowed it down. This is what you want to do. These are the measures you've selected that, you know, should relate to your objective. And here's your 4 players that you're up for consideration, and these are their stats. Your data nerd has gone off and come up with these stats for you. Okay? So, first step. Again, this is all completely fabricated and just for effect. So, first thing you want to do is you want to get rid of any measures that don't actually have an influence on trade-offs between the different options, right? So, for example, if you have something that is basically the same across all your players, all the options you're considering, it's not really going to have an impact, shouldn't have an impact on the decision that you're making, right? And so luckily, that one is also probably not a very good measure, but so we'll get rid of that one. So get rid of it, simplify it. Next step. Let's take a look at the options you have and just select the first one. So that's, you've now selected player A, and you're going to compare all the other players against that one across your measures that are left, right? And so blue, I tried to be aware of the whole green-red color blindness. So blue is good, it's high, or better. Red is worse, yellow is the same, basically. So now these colors, you know, not again. There we go. Again, I won't use the pointer as much, maybe. So really what you're doing now is you're comparing these players to player A. And you can see that this player loses out on 3 of the categories, and the other 2 are tied. So really, you should eliminate that one. It loses across the board, or he, she, if it's a female player. So you can all of a sudden just eliminate. You can now simplify your decision matrix even further. Once you've done that, you can then go to player B and compare the other 2 players to B, same thing, and then now that you're down to, let's just say you're only down to the 3 players, go back to step 1 and look again, are there any measures that are the same across your remaining options? If the answer is yes, then get rid of those measures. You want to simplify this as much as possible. Go through this process to really narrow down which criteria are important in making this decision. Right? Now, once you've done that, hey, you actually still can sit around that table with a bunch of other guys and do the talking. And if you've simplified it enough, and there's not a lot of trade-offs, complex trade-offs required, you could actually just sit there and say, yeah, you know what? We think player B is our option. It kind of basically meets most of our criteria. It outperforms these other players almost across the board. But someone might say, you know what? No, like this guy scores way more. Maybe we actually need to dig in a bit more. And so you can. So if it is still a little more complex in terms of the trade-offs required, and you can't do that trade-off easily, then you could actually try a quantitative, and bring that system 2 thinking into the process now, and try and do that trade-off from a more analytical perspective. So I will give you one good way of doing that. This is the idea of swing weighting. You can actually compare apples to oranges with this method. We won't do it. Looking at our previous example, but you could. And so the way to do that is, you now take a look at your remaining options. You pick, for each category, for each criteria, find your best and worst, and it's not necessarily highest and lowest, right? Because depending on your category, a low number might actually be better. So it's your best and your worst, and you create 2 new options representing those 2 extremes. Forget your options, your players for now. take a look at these two options. And what you want to do is you want to look at, you go one at a time, and you want to look at this. If you were to swing, for example, the scoring, primary points per 60, from 1.2 to 2.1, would that rank these in terms of which swing you would like to see the most, right? So if that is most important to you, that 0.9 points per 60 swing is more important to you than gaining, what is that, 4 inches? Then yes, this might be first, right? So here's an example ranking you might do, and you really did want to fill in that depth on your blue line, so that's your second most important. And this is a good example here that this doesn't have to be all numerical. You can actually use more subjective, non-numerical data in these types of tables as well. Right, so you want to consider both the importance of this measure to you as well as the amount of swing that's involved to rank. Once you've done that, you now want to weight them. So you give your rank number 1 option 100. You go to your rank number 2 and you think to yourself, okay, if that's worth 100, what is the swing from no to yes, or yes to no, in terms of whether it's a defenseman, what is that worth in comparison? So maybe it's 75, maybe it's 50, whatever it is. You go to your third one, here's the weighting compared to your top rank, right? So these numbers will always get lower. Like this can't be 75 and that can't be 80 because that means your rank was wrong, okay? Once you've done all that, in order to actually evaluate this now, you need to go back to your scores across these and you normalize them. So basically for the lowest or the worst, you give a 0, best you give a 1, and then you prorate all the options in between the best and worst in each category, right? Take that, you weight it, you apply the weights, and now you actually have a score. And this is like an analytical, structured process to get you to potentially a decision. Now, the thing is, if you have a bunch of people sitting around that table, you all have done this, and you're all going to come up with different answers. So it's not, you're not done. That is just your specific opinion process. What you want to do now is you want to actually take everybody around the table and compare their scores and see if you actually have come to a consensus or not. So again, here's in comparison to player A, these could be the scores, say, from across everybody else. So hey, player C, definitely third in everybody's list. They're out. Now you can simplify this again. And hey, player B, everybody has them ranked highest except for one person. Well, now you can actually dig in and you can try and understand why does the director of scouting, why did they rank them there? Why did they come with a lower score than for player A? And you can go and look at the weighting and have that conversation, have that discussion. So you're still doing that bunch of guys sitting around the table talking, but now you're talking about the things that really matter, not just what you remember, the recency bias, the confirmation, whatever it is. You're actually talking about things that really matter. So, bottom line on swing weighting, it's not meant to make the decision. The people still have to make that decision, right? So it's really useful for just shining a light on the values that those decision makers are using to make decisions and making them explicit and transparent. As soon as you do that, you can make better decisions. And it's also usually best to eliminate those options that shouldn't even be considered. So you can get that, which, I think, I love this quote from Micah, because it's kind of like this, it's true. If you had somebody in your organization that would just say no every once in a while and force you to actually think about it and justify why you're trying to make a decision, that right there would be an improvement. By the way, if anybody is in a room is thinking about actually doing this, I'll do it for $6.50. So. Yeah. Okay, so almost done. You guys are almost at lunch. So really, going through this process, the biggest research has shown that the biggest improvements in decision making are actually from those first two. I didn't even do those, but those first two steps of clarifying what the problem is, like what's the context around the decision you're trying to make, and getting a good set of objectives and the measures, right? If you know what you want to achieve and how you're, and then what you're measuring, how that relates to that objective, those are the most important things. Collecting the data, doing the analysis, like that helps, but those first two steps are the most important. And then the last thing, just in comparison to that bunch of guys sitting around the table talking, sorry, the G could also stand for gals, I should say, if we want to call it that way. But the gains of doing the structured process over just talking about it are so large that even if you just kind of randomly made up those weights, you'd still get a better result. And that's because those people sitting around the table talking, they're doing that weighting in their head, they just don't know it. Right? So if you're explicit about it, and you can talk about the weightings, then it actually helps. And then the last thought on just how to combat bias in general within organizations and in support of making decisions. First of all, bias is universal. We all have these biases. If you think you don't have bias and it's not affecting your decisions, you're even more susceptible to having it affect your decisions, right? It's really difficult to manage bias in the moment when you're making that decision. You have to have the process set up ahead of time to be able to weed it out. And you really need to encourage processes that cause you to actually think, right? To actually switch your cognitive, analytical brain on, at least for some part of the process, instead of just relying on intuition. And then finally, just that individual cognitive effort is not enough. It needs to be, you need to get into the culture. It needs to be a constant reminder that, hey, biases are in place here. We need to ensure that we're combating bias all the way through. So, I mean, it's so important that, I think we need to actually have a series of talks just on decision making and bias and how to integrate analytics. So, maybe we can, just use the initials and, take videos and put them up on the internet. Everybody could come and watch them. And well, like I said earlier, maybe you shouldn't let nerds name anything. The branding might be off here. Anyway, that is it. Thanks, everybody.
So normally I'd say no one has a question, but does anyone have a question?
Hi, so this topic is close to my heart. My master's was about decision support. So you didn't mention, what do you think about the pair comparisons as the tool to create the actual order of the factors, significance, and even producing weights for them? And so, because it's easier to eliminate the arbitrary number assignment.
Yes, absolutely. So there are, I chose one, like the swing weighting example in terms of how to make the trade-offs, but there's other analytical ways to simplify that decision matrix. And yeah, the pairwise comparisons is, which I think is what you're referencing, is one of those methods that you can use. I already took way too much time today, so I didn't want to go into that as well, but absolutely, yes.
Any more questions?
So coming from the aerospace field, what you described as the swing weighting is almost identical to like a trade study that we do for almost every decision we make. And I think you mentioned in the intro that you're from the engineering field.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if there's any other aspects you think of engineering decision making that could be made to more qualitative decision making, like hockey rosters.
Short answer is probably definitely yes. And yeah, I mean, and this particular example, in my field, we use this as well, and it's because when you're making really big, really important decisions, you need to make sure that you're making the right decision. And I think that if you are thinking about investing 30, 40, 50 million dollars in a player over 6 years, 7 years, you should really put some thought into that decision. So this is one process. There are absolutely others. And again, I think if you take anything away today, it's the idea that any kind of thing that you can introduce into the process that just forces you to turn on that analytical part of your brain and think about why and what's going into the decision is going to make it a better decision.
Thank you very much. So just 2 points before lunch here. If you are going to like the talk, please get me your slides or material or whatever at lunchtime.